House Democrats, led by Judiciary Chair Jerry Nadler, using this new Lewandowski testimony to build what they say is a case for impeachment. They argue that his 5 hours of hostility and stonewalling, including very thin attempts to invoke an executive privilege by someone who never worked in executive branch, is actually, when you take it together, Exhibit A of Donald Trump's lawlessness.
The pattern of obstruction laid out in the Mueller report has not stopped. You showed the American public in real time that the Trump administration will do anything and everything in its power to obstruct the work of the Congress.
Now they're pointing out that obstructing Congress has also been grounds for impeaching a president before.
Mr. Lewandowski, when you refuse to answer these questions, you are obstructing the work of our committee, but you are also proving our point for the American people to see. The president is intent on obstructing our legitimate oversight. You are aiding him in that obstruction, and I will remind you that Article 3 of the impeachment against President Nixon was based on obstruction of Congress.
Now, that is true, but it doesn't mean it's a slam dunk argument for Democrats in this context. In fact, when you follow all of this, whether you're rooting for someone or not, the Democrats don't fully agree. There are new reports about divides that we've been covering and that you've probably observed about impeachment within the Democratic leadership for some time. Speaker Pelosi, though, reportedly now accusing Nadler's committee of basically going beyond their mandate, going too big with all the impeachment talk without laying the groundwork by getting the American public on board and appearing more than willing to make that type of criticism that has been occurring in private, well, to make it public. Take a look. Pelosi telling aides, look, feel free to leak this because, she says, the schism is out there anyway. Now, while those plots go on to figure out what the next steps are in this impeachment probe, Democrats have other fronts in these Trump investigations. The Judiciary Committee considering subpoenas for a different set of Trump officials, which include former Chief of Staff John Kelly, Jared Kushner, Jeff Sessions, and Mueller's old boss, Rod Rosenstein, also pushing for documents related to reports that Trump was dangling pardons for officials who were asked to potentially break the law in order to pursue what he wanted on immigration and border policy. And it goes beyond the Judiciary Committee. The Oversight Committee now demanding information about the Trump administration's spending at his properties, a rolling scandal in plain sight. New reports and documents revealing the military spent over $200,000, again, of your money, at Donald Trump's golf resort in Scotland. That's just one resort. Meanwhile, Intel Chair Adam Schiff threatening to subpoena Donald Trump's Intel chief because of a story that we've also been covering, and it's a doozy. They're refusing to turn over a whistleblower complaint to Congress, which is required by law. Schiff says this has never happened before. Now, you take it together, there are many defenses to allegations, be they of whistleblowers or allegations of presidential obstruction. But consider here, an hour, 24 hours outside of that Lewandowski hearing, that the Trump administration isn't making those kind of broad defenses right now, so much as offering a public strategy that ranges from hiding information, like that whistleblower complaint, to blatant stonewalling, to, as Lewandowski did under oath, just admitting they've been lying about this. And that has congressional Democrats debating what accountability should look like. To kick off our coverage tonight, I want to bring in Nick Ackerman, who worked closely with the Judiciary Committee as a Watergate special prosecutor, Leah Wright-Rigueur, professor at Harvard's Kennedy School, and Matt Miller, who worked at the DOJ during the Obama administration. I want to start with you, Matt, because when you worked for Eric Holder, you handled many hearings that could get contentious and that often had all kinds of interpretations about who won and lost. What was your takeaway from what was achieved yesterday?
You know, I think the Democrats advanced the ball on the legal front, and I think there are two questions you have to ask on impeachment. One is legal, one is political, and they certainly advanced the ball on the legal front, especially in that last half hour when Lewandowski was counseled by or was questioned by outside counsel Barry Burke. I think they showed, you know, they were able to reiterate that the president did commit obstruction of justice in this act that Corey Lewandowski was involved in, trying to curtail the Mueller report. And then they made a case on this clip that you showed from Chairman Nadler that the president is obstructing justice. I think the bigger question is, did they advance the ball forward on the political side? And that's where, you know, I think it's impossible to know. You know, we know that the Speaker of the House is watching the polls, and those haven't moved. But the legal case has surely marched forward. I think the question will be, Has this hearing moved the political case forward? And over the next set of hearings and over the next few months, as they try to get other witnesses, largely by enforcing subpoenas in court, can putting all of those together advance the political case? And we don't know the answer to that question yet.
Nick?
Well, I think what's going to happen here is there's a lot of other Trump cronies that have to be brought in to testify. Lewandowski's not the only one. They have to bring in Jeff Sessions. They have to bring in Don McGahn. All of those can have a combined effect. What's really missing here that we had in the Watergate situation was a cooperative prosecutor. What's going on now with William Mr. Cover-Up Barr, who is not producing any of the underlying documents in the Mueller investigation. He's not producing the statements that people made so that these people can be effectively cross-examined in the course of these hearings.
So what do they do about it?
Well, what they have to do is do the best they can with the Mueller report. What they have to do is they have to go into court and try and push to get that underlying information. Under the law, they are entitled to the grand jury information now. They are entitled to those underlying interview reports. I mean, basically, under the Constitution, and I brought my Constitution here, it basically says the House of Representatives shall have the sole power of impeachment. That means that a court that is enforcing these subpoenas, their only job is to enforce it. If people don't produce, they go to jail.
What grade would you give Lewandowski as a witness?
Probably a D-. I mean, he is probably one of the worst witnesses. And when Barry Burke got a hold of him, I mean, he was really able to cross-examine him effectively.
Do you think the Democrats made a mistake by having Burke wait to the end when he clearly had the firepower?
Absolutely. In the Watergate situation with the Senate Select Committee initially, they had staff people that were actually doing the examination. There wasn't this 5 minutes here, 5 minutes there. To do this properly, you have to have a real cross-examination, knowing that the person that you're examining is a liar, and he's going to continue to lie. So what you've got to do is point out those lies through prior statements, through what they've said in the press, through what they said to the special counsel's office, and it has to be a very coordinated, effective cross-examination. You can't do that in 5 minutes. You need at least a half hour to do it. And that's what they have to do with each of these witnesses. And they have to tie it together. I mean, this is not obstruction of justice, is not some theoretical sort of exercise here. It had real-world implications here. When Donald Trump tried to get Manafort to clam up and not say anything, telling him that he was a brave soul, that had a real-world effect in terms of Manafort not telling the truth. You had a federal district court judge that found that he lied about providing polling data to the Russians. And if you look at what was left for Mueller, he had all of this polling data going over to the Russians. He had Rick Gates as a witness, but he didn't have the tie-in to actual people in the campaign that were involved in that, like Manafort. Yeah. Manafort knew this. And if he had cooperated and had cooperated, contrary to what Trump was encouraging to do, which is a witness tampering, obstruction of justice, we'd be in a much different situation right now. That is a real impact of what this obstruction of justice has done to this situation.
Yeah, and you also mentioned the people who ran the campaign. I mean, one of them sitting in federal prison, Manafort, and he took over for the one yesterday who, under oath, told the Congress, yeah, I'll lie unless I'm threatened with jail time. That's sort of the standard he put out. Professor, I want to ask you about the politics of all of this. As we do see these interesting reports about Pelosi and Nadler, reading from Politico, which has some leaks that they say are sort of from inside these tense meetings, Pelosi criticizing the Judiciary Committee's handling of impeachment in harsh terms, complaining that committee aides have advanced the push for ousting Trump far beyond where the House Democratic Caucus stands. Democrats don't have the votes on the floor to impeach Trump, Pelosi says, quote, and you can feel free to leak this, Pelosi added. And I can only, of course, read that in Politico because somebody leaked it to Politico. What's going on there, and how problematic is that for people who are hoping, well, any effort to do this is going to come in the fall or never, because then you're into 2020?
Right. So I think Lewandowski's testimony, the hearings, should be a slap in the face for all Democrats. It should be a kind of wake-up call that you are dealing with something that we are not used to dealing with. We've seen this with Donald Trump before. We've seen this with his kind of behavior, the stonewalling, all of this. But it is another dimension when you have the hearings, when you have somebody, Lewandowski, directly obeying orders and openly flaunting the rule of law and various conventions around this. And Democrats clearly have no idea and are not unified in what to do. Now, with Nancy Pelosi, I think there are two ways that we can look at this. Either she is really that angry, or this could be good cop, bad cop. So floating the idea out there that, that we are divided, et cetera, and I want to make sure that we are politically behind this, but also allowing other Democrats to really do the dirty work for her. And that dirty work is around impeachment. But I just have to say, at some point, Democrats are either going to have to put up or shut up, because audiences want something. They want some kind of resolution, and they really want accountability, particularly with the people who are testifying, particularly with Donald Trump. You can't talk about it. At some point, you have to be about it as well.
Fair points, all stated. And Matt, if it is good cop, bad cop, or something like that, you lived through a time on the Benghazi investigation, on the email investigation, on other ways that the House Republicans went after the administration you served, where it seemed more like bad cop, or bad cop, bad cop, bad cop. I mean, there were like 6 Benghazi committees. Now, that doesn't mean that is something to automatically echo. But I wonder what you think in this intersection between the legal process and Congress being tough, what you think of the Democrats' approach.
Well, it depends on what you think the outcome ought to be. If you think the outcome ought to end with the president not being impeached by the House, then you probably think all this division is okay, and the Speaker slowing the House Judiciary Committee down is okay. But if you want the president to be impeached, I think what this division means is that it's not going to happen, because impeaching the president is not something you can do as a kind of half-hearted effort. It's something the entire party has to be behind, and all the resources of the House have to be behind, because as I pointed out earlier, it's not just a legal question, it's a political question. It's a political question inside the House, and it's a political question out in the country with voters. And if voters are hearing that House Democrats don't even agree with them amongst themselves that the president ought to be impeached, then you're surely not going to convince a majority of voters that he ought to be impeached. So I think until Democrats are united on this question, unless and until Democrats are united on this question, the House can pursue its inquiry, they can move forward, they can get a lot of evidence. But I think it's just people who are waiting for the president to be impeached. That's not going to happen unless the Speaker and some of the others who are holding out come around. And so far, that's not the case.
Yeah, and Leah, I mean, that's what, if you go out into the country, there's on the Democratic side, a lot of folks are already in agreement with Chairman Nadler, and so that's why it looks like a standstill. Take a look at Nadler making the case.
I am very troubled that the White House counsel sitting behind you are preventing you from answering these very basic questions that go to the heart of the president's conduct we are investigating. Not only are you not a government employee, but these questions are about the president's efforts to interfere with a criminal investigation of himself and have nothing to do with official government business. He is obstructing our congressional investigation by preventing you from telling the American people the truth about his misconduct.
So, Leah, viewers would be forgiven for thinking, well, if Jerry Nadler's worked his whole life as an expert on law and the Constitution and is chair of the committee, and you heard it right there. He just said that the president obstructed justice. At what point does he call a vote of the committee to try to move articles of impeachment?
Well, I think at some point, I mean, this is what he is gearing up for. This is what he is setting up for. I think several of his colleagues in Congress have also been laying the groundwork for this kind of really big call. And the holdup right now is Nancy Pelosi. And Nancy Pelosi says that, her various factions are also holdups. But part of what I think is going on here is that they're essentially trying to force Nancy Pelosi's hand. They're trying to force moderate Democrats' hand. And at the very least, get the political capital and showcase that the president is engaging in behavior that they believe is impeachable, to try at least and generate some goodwill or good sentiment around impeachment from the general population. Because if you don't have more than, I think right now, 37% support from the general public, then Nancy Pelosi is not budging, moderates in Congress are not budging, and all of a sudden you've opened yourself up to a very different kind of political conversation. But it's very clear that a good portion of Democrats for some time have been looking for an opportunity, and the opportunity is now here, and they're ready to force their hand.
Leah Wright, Ragor, and Matt Miller, I want to thank you for joining us. Nick, I have one more question for you. Thanks to both of you. You said something else that I just want to ask you about before we finish up, because a lot of folks are watching this going, gosh, if the person who did best was at the end, why can't he go earlier? You said he should. So what gets in the way of that? Is it the alleged ego of certain other members of Congress? Is it tradition? I mean, if this is important enough to deal with alleged law breaking, it ought to be important enough to scramble the order of speaking at a hearing, no?
Well, they've done somewhat of that. I mean, they've made the rules so that staff people can ask questions. And so getting to that point, what they didn't realize was that this was not going to be simply a question and answer. This had to be a cross-examination of a witness who was going to lie straight through. And you had to show he was a liar, and you had to show his colors. And to do that, you've got to be an experienced cross-examiner, not a politician. Most members of Congress are not trained to do this. And if any of them, none of them, I think, were on the Watergate committees or were involved in any of the Watergate investigations, those committees had staff people who did some of the best questioning. And they just didn't realize that until they got burnt in the first part of that hearing. And they realized that they had to get somebody out there that knew what they were doing and knew how to cross-examine a lying witness. And they've got a whole series of those people that they have to put on in front of the American public.
And you say they got burnt, and as the saying goes, burn me once, etc.
Exactly.
Nick Ackerman, always great to learn from you. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.